I'd always had this kind of behind the scenes love affair with lived philosophy, philosophy that is applied in actual life. And just through ups and downs and some meanders, it kind of took me 5 years to get to where I am now. Finally find myself in this place where I'm starting to figure out, okay, if you want to call it my second iteration of my life, of my professional life, maybe what I'd like to do is dedicate myself to this idea of what philosophy would look like if it's actually lived and something you can apply in your everyday life.
Would you say that philosophy is your second nature then?
You know what? The thing is, it's interesting, right? It's like, it's one of those experiences where you look back on your life and you go, you know what? Actually, I was probably always somewhat of an armchair philosopher. I was always doing philosophy. And definitely, even in the martial arts and the way that I taught, most people that had trained with me, if you spoke to them today, I'm sure they would say, absolutely. You know what? Rodney was one of those coaches who didn't just teach us, quote unquote, how to fight. He always talked about like the deeper ideas and principles and the philosophical implication of applying those methods in everyday life, right? And so one of the things that I've always tried to get across to my students is that, especially in the later years, maybe not so much in my 20s, right? We were all like kind of, gung-ho when we were in our 20s, but definitely as time went on, I started seeing what I would argue as the value in being a mindful warrior, more than just somebody that, used their fists to, deal with any situation they found, but rather that there's a better way to actually deal with problems. And that's the mindful aspect of it. And one of the things that I've tried to do in my own life, at least definitely over the last decade, is to show up in life more calm, more present, more focused, and more resilient. So, philosophy then has always been part of what I've done.
Are we born free into this world? Or are we subject to this cosmic dice roll? With a lot of factors playing.
That's a hard question, right? So let's kind of situate the essay. You call it a book. Look, I'm honored you called it a book. I kind of viewed it more as an essay, right?
Essay.
And
a philosophical essay.
Philosophical essay.
Yeah.
It's definitely a philosophical essay.
Even more difficult than a book. Yeah.
I tried my best. So, the thing is, like, the way that I wanted to approach this, actually where it came from was from conversations with my own two sons. So I have two young adult sons. One is 24, the other one's turning 20 this year. My youngest is still in university. My eldest is now out of university and kind of in the world. And invariably what I started finding happening, which is, I think, is quite natural as a father, when you're talking to your sons who are now, quote unquote, in the real world, right? And they have to be responsible for themselves, is all these conversations about the world and how it shows up. And, the word is absurd. It's like, it's insane. Like, how do you make it in this world? None of it makes any sense. And it's immediately evident that you need to show up in a way that may not be the way that you want to show up. And so there's this conflict between what you want to do on the one hand and what the modern society says you should do in order to be successful. So there's this tension, right? And so through that tension, through the discussion around that, the essay emerged. I started writing it. And look, to be honest, and what I did was, and maybe this was evident when you read it, is I wanted to just write it. I didn't want to kind of burden it with, citations and everything. I just wrote it. I just sat down and I wrote it. And what came to mind came to mind. I mean, I don't know what was driving it, my daemon, I don't know. But the thing is, I just wrote it. Yeah. And of course, it's very evident that there is a lot of influence there. Like, if you have read anything around the existentialists, it's very clear that I'm drawing from an existential frame. But trying to put it in my own words. And like I said, those words literally came from conversations with my son. So to your question, are we free? I can only answer that from how I see it, right? And the way that I perceive things. So I've always felt constraint ever since I was a very young child. Things happen to you as a young child that you don't fully understand, but then later on in life as an adult, you're able to reflect back. And it's very, very evident to me that I was different to my peers. Like the way that I was showing up, for whatever reason, I don't know why, I just didn't see the world like everybody else saw the world. So I'll give you one example. I remember being a young child and all the boys were always so competitive. Like competition was a big deal. And everything that they did, it didn't matter what it was. If it was a soccer game, a football game, whatever they were doing, it always devolved into competitiveness. It's one of the reasons I didn't want to play those games, because I never understood competition. And the funny thing is, even today as an adult, I don't get it. Like, I don't understand why you need to do something in order to win. Why can't you just play it for the fun of playing it, you know, or for the collaboration, or just for, you know, building relationships? So I've never understood it. So I've always had this tension with what the modern world says you should do in order to be quote unquote successful versus how I was showing up. You know, as we all do, and I think this answers the question in some respect when we say, are we actually free? Later on in life, I naturally took on what society said I should do in order to be considered successful, right? So some of those examples would be when I created my martial arts program and it went global and I was doing fantastically financially. You know, I had the house in the right zip code, in the right neighborhood in South Africa. I drove a really fancy sports car. I was lucky enough to have the fortune to allow my children to go to private schools, all these kinds of things, right? So I did everything or had everything. On the outside looking in, society, modern society would say, Rodney's successful. But I didn't feel that way. And that was always the tension for me. It was like, yeah, okay, I'm doing all these things that society says you should do to be quote unquote successful and happy, but I don't feel happy.
Yeah, that's why something was missing all along. And
yes, but I think that's for many people, if they're really honest, right? You know, for most people, they feel like they are constrained, like they have to do things in order just to fit in. Because when you start talking in opposition to what's considered quote unquote normal, you get ostracized as being abnormal. And there are consequences, social consequences to that as well.
Do you think that people from childhood to adulthood, as they grow up, get a better grasp of that complexity of the system?
I think some do. I think some do. Typically those that do, like I said, are ostracized and are seen as abnormal, right? As like outliers or crazy people. You know, they start seeing the cracks in the system and they try to rebel against it and then get the pushback. I think for the vast majority of people, sadly, and I feel like this is part of what I'm trying to get out there, I think for the vast majority of people, they don't know what to name as the problem. They know there's an issue. They know they're not happy. They know they're not doing well. They know that potentially they're suffering with their mental health. There's a dis-ease, right? But they don't know where to place it because it makes perfect sense that they wouldn't know that. Think about it like this, right? I think everybody in the modern world that is current and is watching what is happening in the world would all agree that clearly in the modern so-called civilized world that we live in, the industrial world, that there is an epidemic of a health crisis going on in mental health. Everywhere you look, right, there's a mental health crisis. But look at how it's framed. It's framed in this way. If you are depressed, if you are not feeling mentally healthy, you are the problem. There's something wrong with you. You have a chemical imbalance. It's always put on your shoulders. And so the message to you is you need to fix yourself because you're the problem. And if you fix yourself, be it through whatever method that may be, therapy, medication, then you will feel normal and you'll be able to slot into the world and feel okay. That's the message that's sent. However, this is my view, of course, I see the elephant in the room. And my argument would be no, actually, you know what? There's nothing wrong with you. Your body is resisting an unnatural form of living, and it's the modern society, it's the environment that's making you feel sick. But if we acknowledge that, let's say we acknowledge it and we say, okay, that makes sense, that's true, then we have a problem. And the problem is now we have to confront the society that we live in. We have to look at it from a different perspective. We have to say, maybe the issue isn't everybody that seems to be having a mental health crisis. It's not them individually. The reason that's happening is because society, there's something about society, the behavior and what is accepted or what is accelerated or what is put out there as the thing you should do is causing this dis-ease. Exactly. Which would then require a complete overhaul of the system. Exactly. But the system is geared towards hyper-competition, hyper-individuality, material wealth, so-called scarcity. All these things is what's kind of pushed down our throats as seen as that is normal. That's what you should be doing. You should be competing. You should be doing whatever you need to get to the top, regardless of who you have to climb over to get there, right? You should be amassing material wealth because that's your fitness indicator to the modern world that you've made it, that you've arrived. You know, all of these things are told what you should do to be successful. But I think for a vast majority of people, that's never going to happen because the only people that seem to achieve that are the ones that have worked out how to game the system. And if you're not one of those people that can game the system, then you fall behind. And then you suffer from a crisis, an existential crisis, and then you're told, no, you're depressed. But the reason you're depressed is because you have a chemical imbalance. Take these pills, that'll sort your chemicals out, and then you'll be okay and be back and slot back into normal.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle, yes. Nobody denies that. And we're going to mention if there are any viable solutions we could have an escape from this situation as we move on with our discussion. If you have a good education regarding education as conditioning, so he says that if you have a good education, you've gone to the best schools, you have internalized that there are certain things it wouldn't do to say, it wouldn't do to think, so there's a powerful mechanism, an effective education, and then indoctrination, and then he starts telling this story when he was in Sweden a couple of years ago, and he noticed that taxi drivers were being very friendly to him, much more than he expected. And when he finally asked one of them, why is everybody being so nice? The taxi driver pulled out a T-shirt, he said, every taxi driver has, and that T-shirt had a picture of him, Noam Chomsky, and a quote in Swedish of something he had once said in university when he was asked, what happens to people of independent mind? And then he replied, they become taxi drivers.
I love it.
Yeah, I mean, what is your comment on this? And I mean, the best of all is that you are willingly participating to your own restraint. Nobody forces you to do so.
Is that true though? Think about it, right? Like let's say I decide today that I want to opt out of the system. I don't want to play by the system's rules anymore. I'm deciding that I'm going to go a different path. What's available to me? What would happen to me? In short order, I'd be homeless. Before I know it, I'll be sleeping under a bridge. Right? That's what happens when you opt out. I mean, ideally, it would be great if I could opt out, go into the wilderness and be self-sufficient. That's not available to most of us. And, you know, as skilled as I am, I don't think my survival skills are that great. I'm not sure how long I would actually last out in the wild. So I think we are constrained, even if we don't want to accept it or acknowledge it. You know, just on what Chomsky was saying, I mean, in my essay, right, Living the Absurd, I talk about education as conditioning. Yeah, you know, I say that, you know, education functions to mold individuals into compliant workers and consumers. It suppresses unique potential. And in you internalize external authority, you know. I always think about my partner when she talks about growing up in Eastern Europe, and how growing up they were taught that anybody of authority immediately should have respect, you know, and that's how she grew up. So it's built within the framework, and I think that's what Chomsky is alluding to, is that, you know, even if we don't see it that way, it is actually built in, because that's the thing, right? I mean, oftentimes we hear about things like, oh, you know, education is there to bring out your creative spirit and so on. That's not true, though, because in most of the times what you see in life, right, when people are creative, what are they doing? They're rallying against the system. They're pushing against it. They're the ones that are the outliers. And you get your legs taken out from underneath you very quickly in the kind of standard educational system, should you do that, right? Because they don't want somebody like you in the class, because now you're a disruptor, and they want compliant students. They want you just to kind of, you know, nod your head and go along with what's said. So yeah, I think we are always, and I say this in the essay, but we're always working within a constraint. And I recognize the constraint. It exists, it's a real thing. The question really is like, knowing that the constraint exists, is there anything we can actually do, right? That's really the question. And that's the kind of the second part of the essay where I dive into that.
So there are definitely some boundaries, both external ones.
Yeah, I didn't ask, nobody asked my permission if it was okay for me to be born in South Africa.
Yeah.
You know, historically, my family come from Scotland. Mm-hmm. You know, back, if you follow the family tree, it goes all the way back to Scotland. Mm-hmm. So that applies to everybody that's being born right now. Nobody asked to be born where they are. And for some people, they're born lucky, you know, they, at least in the modern world sense, you know, they're born in a family that has affluence, that has access to everything. I was born in a family that we grew up on the south side of Johannesburg. That's like government housing. The closest proximity or approximation to that would be the projects in the US. So I grew up poor. I didn't ask for that. And growing up poor put enormous constraints, more than, say, somebody who was affluent, on my ability to find my way within this modern system and to make it. It's not to say that some people don't make it, because they do, right? And we always celebrate that. Look, that guy, that person came from nothing and he's become successful. Yes, that's true. And I suppose in that way, for whatever reason, I was able to become successful, even though everything in the beginning said I shouldn't. But I could also make the argument that 99% of the kids that I grew up with never did become successful, at least not in what the modern world says success is. You know, many of them crashed and burned, many of them went to prison, you know, all of these kinds of things, selling drugs on the street corner. I mean, that's just, that is a reality, right?
Yeah. I'm gonna say why you became successful, and that's not the case for others. I mean, you distinguish yourself from others based on the external factors, which were not our choice in the first place. That's the worst thing. I mean,
there's also the internalization of a message, right? The message is also from society. So I'll use myself as an example. Mm-hmm. I grew up poor, right? There's a stigma with being poor. That stigma was very evident anytime I engaged with anybody that wasn't poor. As soon as they heard from which neighborhood I came from, which school I had come from, it immediately changed the conversation, right? So we also need to be careful not to blame people for internalizing that, because it almost gets forced on you inadvertently without you even realizing it. You start bringing that into your embodiment. I mean, I grew up, like I said, in an environment that wasn't so great. The schools weren't great either. I had on many occasions where teachers told me to my face, they said, you will never amount to anything. You will never become anything in this world. Because I was the kid at school, sitting at my desk, staring out the window. I was like somewhere else most of the time. I wasn't at school. I was somewhere else. I was in my imagination. I was riding dragons in the clouds, right? And because I wasn't focused and attentive and listening like a good little soldier, I was told that I wouldn't amount to anything. Now, some people,
doesn't tell you, it makes you stronger.
Sure, but that's true only to a point. Again, there's no way that I could say why I broke through and other people didn't, right? Because there were other kids that I grew up with that heard the exact same thing, that also I internalized it. I had a lot of self-doubt. I had a lot of insecurity growing up. Plus my home wasn't great either, right? My mother was a raging, abusive alcoholic. I had friends that were going through similar experiences. For some reason I broke through and they didn't, right? And so I mean, we could discuss why that might be. And again, who knows why you have a propensity for one thing and somebody else doesn't. Like my thing was growing up, I loved books. I loved reading. And I always tell the story because it's an important part of my journey. 2 weeks before I got kicked out of the house at 17 and found myself sleeping homeless on the inner city streets of Johannesburg, I had read Viktor Frankl's book, The Freedom from the Known. No, sorry, Man's Search for Meaning. That's Christian. So I'd read Man's Search for Meaning, which was Viktor Frankl's, and Freedom from the Known, which is Krishnamurti's book. Just 2 weeks before that, I had read those two books, right? And so those two books, really, and not to say that I understood everything.
They served as a compass. Basically.
But it definitely served as a compass. Definitely also Frankl's kind of whole discussion in his book about, you can be in the worst possible place, but if you change your attitude about it, you can get through this. And so I took that to heart, right?
Yes,
and so I was able to apply that. That didn't make things suddenly completely easy. And it did, I still struggled and I still, made lots of left turns when I should have gone right. But it definitely gave me some idea of what is possible, right? Like that there are situations where people have been in 100,000 times worse of a place than I've been in, and they've been able to come through that. So I was lucky.
Yeah.
Many other people didn't have those experiences. They weren't able to have access to those books. They never read those things. They never had those discussions. So who knows to what degree that actually was part of the reason why they were never able to, pull themselves out of the mud, so to speak, and actually flourish.
Yeah.
But also that's the other thing is too, in that, right? People discount luck. Sometimes you're just lucky. Sometimes just what happens and you find yourself in the right place, right? And you make, you can say, oh, I made that decision and that was the right decision. But, a lot of times at that moment in time, when you're making these decisions, you don't always know if it's the right decision. Where I've worked from, what has actually been beneficial to me, and I know this kind of goes probably counter to what like most kind of hardcore, kind of classical philosophers would say, but I've always trusted my intuition. And I think in that way that saved me. Like my intuition overrid any kind of doubt that I had. Like I had the doubts, like, what am I going to do? I have no idea. Is this the right decision to make? But I went with my intuition. I kind of use that almost as a joke. Sometimes I talk about the daemon, right? You know what a daemon is, right? Yeah. It's kind of like your guardian angel. I always felt like there was this kind of guiding hand that steered me in the right direction. But you need to be open to that, and you need to be willing to listen to that message. And I think that's what I did. And because I did do that, looking back on life, because it's always like it, in that moment, you're going, oh my God, this was the worst experience of my life, and I don't know how I'm going to get out of it. And you make decisions, but then you look back on your life sometimes and you go, wow, like it's almost like everything was set up exactly as it needed to be set up in order to get to where I am. So I didn't land up here by accident. Be that just, me saying that in my head to make me feel better, but it does make me feel better. So that's a good thing, right? Yeah. Like just that sense of like, okay, you know what? Everything has ultimately happened for a reason, but because I was opening myself to some intelligence that was beyond me. And you can, call it whatever you want to call it, but I allowed that to direct my next move. And that ultimately led me on the path where I landed up.
Yeah, I believe what you say. You've been listening to your internal messages all along and acting accordingly. Do you believe that if it weren't for the smartphones and social media, would the situation be of any difference?
I think in some respects, because I think what we've done is we've handed a lot of our agency over to this technology.
Yeah.
And again, we've been sold that. We've been told that, all these problems you see in the world, it's going to be solved by technology. That's the message, right? It's kind of like if anybody remembers that cartoon, The Jetsons. It was supposed to be happening around about now, right? At least in the cartoon when it came out. This era where we're in, there was supposed to be flying cars and robots in the houses and all these kinds of things, right? So we've always been sold this message that technology is going to be the thing that saves us. And so, unfortunately, I think a lot of people have kind of allowed themselves to believe that and not see themselves as the ultimate technology. I think like anything, right? Technology is great as a tool. I use technology. We're clearly using technology now to do this call, right? So there's a lot of amazing things. And of course, I appreciate technology just like anybody else. I mean, I love the fact that tonight I can have a hot shower. I can turn on the tap, the faucet, and water comes out. That, I can put food into the fridge and it doesn't spoil. All these things are miracles of modernity, right? But I think there's a danger when you outsource your agency to things like your phone and you see so many people now just so invested in an external way of living that they've forgotten what it's like to inhabit their own body. And so we see this, right? And we know this and we hear it all the time. You hear these remarks of like, we're the most connected we've ever been, ever in human history, but yet we're the most lonely. And actually, probably, if you want to kind of boil it down, we could make the argument that the thing that's the most important aspect of yourself, the thing that has the most value is your attention. And we know, at least this is my experience, where you place your attention is what you become. So like if you're placing your attention into things that are just doom scrolling, mindless things, there is going to be a consequence of that. That's going to reframe how you inhabit the world, and your experience in the world is going to be very different to somebody who doesn't do that, right? I talk about, not so much in the essay, but I do write about this on my Substack, is this idea of an unoptimized life, right? Finding moments to unoptimize your life so that you're not always tethered and connected to this technological frame, right? And it can be as simple as going for a walk without your phone, without your earphones plugged in, and without a destination. Why does everything always have to have a destination? Just go for a walk, and wherever you land up, you land up. And anybody who's traveled, and I've traveled a lot, and I'm sure you have too, if you recall some of your best memories, at least this is for me, like one of my best memories of traveling, it's just not knowing where I was, not looking where I was, and just going for an adventure. Just walk, and you land up in some of the most incredible places that if you curated your experience, if you got Google Maps out and you said, I'm going to go from here to here, from there to there, you would have missed so many things that you would never have seen had you not just turned left instead of going right. I'm going to go down this alleyway, and then suddenly, I did this in Porto a little while ago. I was in Portugal, and I turned down this alleyway for whatever reason. I just, my embodiment said, go down this alleyway. And I landed up in one of the most beautiful churches I've ever seen. It wasn't on any criteria. It wasn't on any map. It wasn't like a tourist thing. It was just there. It just happened there. Yeah. It was more of a church that was specifically for that village, and it wasn't on the tourist trail, right? Well, if you plan everything, if you curate everything, there's no magic. There's no magic. You lose the magic, right? Yeah. So that's exactly that. So like so much of the mystique and the magic of being human, beautifully messy, unpredictable human, is lost when we give our agency over to technology. we lose the best of what it is to be human. And now we've got this other thing, this other elephant in the room on the rise, AI, right? Which is coming in really fast and really hard, which is going to create more of this problem that we're talking about.
Yeah, because everything is commodified from a point on, and there's no meaning. What would you consider as the first step towards reclaiming agency and finding meaning in a meaningless world?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
I think the first step is recognizing that it exists in the first place, right? It's like that old the old
accepting the reality.
Accepting that it's real. Like, don't pretend that doesn't exist. I mean, if you listen to most people who are proponents of, say, capitalism, of this thing that we're talking about, right? It's very evident that they don't want anybody to see that there's a crack in the system, that the system is broken. They keep saying, no, the system is perfectly fine. It's you're the problem. We're back to that again, right? Like, the reason why you're not succeeding, it's not the system. The system is open to anybody that applies themselves, with enough will and with enough grit. So you don't have that. That's why you're failing. I mean, if ever I heard a lie, that is it right there. For all the reasons we talked about, geography, where you're born, all these things. It's absolute nonsense, right? And especially if you come from a culture that has set a situation where they make it even harder for you to move up to achieve, right? Like, you could imagine if you're from a certain part of the world and you happen to be a woman and you're not allowed to be educated, you're not allowed to drive, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. I mean, it's very easy to say, oh, the system is perfect, it's you that's the problem, right? Without taking into account the situational environment that you find yourself in.
There's a lot of cynicism in these statements.
But I think that's the first step, is that you have to acknowledge, okay, you know what, this system isn't good. It's not good for the human health. And the fact that you acknowledge it is the first step, because then you can say to yourself, look, and this is what I say in my essay, is like, I'm not denying it. I'm not trying to be all utopian thinking, I mean, we are constrained. So the question is, like, what can I do within the constraints? But it still comes back to the fact that I want people to understand. This is the message I'm trying to get across, because I have to tell myself this too. And I have to tell my children this, right? You are not broken. There's actually fundamentally nothing wrong with you. The reason you're feeling the way you're feeling is because the environment, the system that you find yourself in, is creating this kind of absurdity within inside, this existential crisis. And you just haven't recognized the fact that the system is the problem. What keeps happening is you keep internalizing it and keep saying it must be me. I must be the problem. Once you realize that you're not the problem, then that gives you a very different way of viewing the world, right? So you can play within the system as you need to, right? But then you can also make conscious choices to choose not to be played by the system. And that's kind of a radical freedom that is still constrained, because we're not 100% free, but at least we are freer than we were before we knew that. And that's at least one step in the right direction. I kind of am not a fan of this kind of Pollyanna thinking, this kind of utopian thinking. Like for example, like, I often view it this way, and this will probably get me into trouble, but I see, like, a lot of the self-help stuff. We need the self-help stuff, right? Like, you look at the self-help genre, what is it, like a $5 trillion industry every year? It's something insane, right? Whatever it is, it's off the charts, right? Do we need self-help? Absolutely, because clearly we were struggling, right? But if you look at most self-help, what it is, it's just helping you basically put a Band-Aid over the problem so that you can go back into the stream of the system, so that you can just basically play one more day, just be a better cog in the machine. And then a couple of days later, it starts breaking down. That self-help material that you ingested starts breaking down. It doesn't work so well, which it won't, because it's not dealing with the real problem we've been talking about. And so then you back onto the treadmill and you're reading the next self-help book. So we know from research that most people who start with one self-help book generally go on to read more, right? And then it wouldn't be, I've been into some friends' houses who are like right into the whole self-help thing. And they'll have like 50 to 100 titles of self-help books on their shelf, on their bookshelf, but they're still not coping. They're still struggling, right? And then everything we get told to do is part of this kind of insidious thing to try to get us to conform. Like, you think about, like, now there'll be all these different performance hacks, right? Take nootropics, do your breathing exercises, the breathing protocol, the 5 a.m. club, right? Get up by 5 a.m. in the morning before the sun comes up. All these kinds of things you think you're doing because that's going to make you healthier. It's going to improve your well-being. But actually, all it's really doing is making you a better cog in the machine. It's making you basically just, you know, less of a problem for the machine to deal with. And so coming back, I went off on a tangent, but coming back would be, yes, recognizing that this thing actually exists. It's like that old adage, right? Does a fish know that it's in water? I think the thing there too, though, right, Demetrius, the thing is, like, you need to acknowledge that you are consciously participating in this that we've been talking about. You are consciously participating in the machine. Now, the fact that I recognize it, the fact that I know that I'm consciously participating in it, does, at least from my perspective, I feel like it changes your attitude towards other people. So where, for example, you might have gone to the store and you have somebody who clearly doesn't want to be there, they've got a bad attitude, you know, they don't want to smile, and you kind of, like, maybe in the past you would walk out and go, man, why do these companies hire people like that? Like, that's your front-facing people. Why do you hire people that are so bitter and so angry and so grumpy? Like, I won't go back to that shop, right? That's how most people react. They get upset, right? This is the kind of the rumor mill that we have. I also used to be like that. So I'll take a hit for the team and say, look, you know, I was part of that problem. However, now I go in and I go, you know what? I know what's happening. I recognize it. And I don't blame that person for showing up that way. It kind of makes sense that they would be. I mean, because if I was in their shoes, I'd probably be feeling exactly the same, right? It's probably not such a great working environment. They're going to be there at the crack of dawn until the sun goes down. They don't get paid a lot of money. They have to deal with a lot of people's, you know, bullshit all day long. You know, you'd also be like that. So rather than being an asshole about it, now you can actually maybe be polite, you know, be the thing you want to see in the world. That's really what it comes down to, right? It's like, you don't fix anything by doing the very thing that you're rallying against. What you do is you do the exact opposite. Show up differently, right? Talk to people differently, engage with them differently. And I think that's super important. As some, like, that would be like my second step, right? Once you know, then know that you are consciously participating in yourself, right? And then you can change your behavior and the way that you interact with people. And we need more of that, right? Because, you know, you go anywhere into any big city and most of the time people just look so grumpy and upset and in a bad mood. But you know what? You know, if you don't walk in their shoes, and if you were, you might be feeling exactly the same way.
How true. There's a point in your essay where you mentioned creative defiance. In your opinion, does creative defiance symbolize something rebellious in one's attempt to raise his voice and stand out of the crowd? Or is it like keep going one's way by not changing direction, retaining his humanity principles and core values in the face of systemic pressures?
I think that you just said it. It's like, okay, so for me, creative defiance is kind of comes back to what I just said about, you know, being conscious that you're in the system. But now I get to choose how I want to show up.
Exactly.
Do I show up the way everybody else is showing up because they're feeling the pressure of the machine, and that's the kind of negative cycle and behavior that they're exhibiting, which, you know, you're conscious now, so you understand why that is, but you can choose to say, you know what, I'm going to show up differently. You know, where I could be angry, I'm gonna, at the very least, right? You don't have to be all happy, but at the very least, I'm just going to be present rather than buying into this thing, right? So this comes back, isn't this the fundamental premise behind things like Stoicism, you know, your idea of virtue? of living a virtuous life. This is kind of what we're saying, right? I mean, that's what we're projecting here. We're saying, yeah, we're projecting that we need to have the virtues, and the virtues is everything, how you treat people, how you want to be treated, and how you show up in the world. And, you know, ultimately, I think everybody wants to be treated with respect, with dignity, with compassion, with understanding. And if that is the case, and I believe it is, then what happens if each one of us decide to choose to show up that way? That's what Viktor Frankl was talking about, right? Is that, you know, you get to choose. Everything can be taken away from you. You can have nothing. You can be in a really bad place, but you still get to choose your own given attitude in any set of circumstances. That's what he said. And that's kind of what I took on at 17 years old. I'm like, I'm in a really bad place. This really sucks. And it's not nice. And I acknowledge it. It's not like I'm trying to, you know, avoid it or pretend that it doesn't exist, but how I choose my attitude next is going to determine how this experience is going to unfold. And I think that's powerful, because what it does do is you reclaim your agency, right? You reclaim your own inner power in that very moment by doing something like that. While everybody else is not doing that and they're doing as the machine is dictating they should, you've decided that you're going to show up differently. And that, I think, is a beautiful thing to take on. Is it easy? Absolutely not. Do you always get it right? Absolutely not. But the whole part of this is to try as best as you can to embody it and to show up that way as much as you possibly can in every interaction in your life.
Got to have guts, for sure. I mean, it doesn't happen overnight, but there's always this, you know, these cultivating spaces that you can gradually build: psychological, relational, artistic, existential, where you found in the midst of.
And you know what, it doesn't even have to be big things. It can just be small. Start off small.
Yeah.
Like if you say, like, where do I start with this? Okay, you know what? Every time you go up to the corner store up here, there's a lady there. She always seems that she's just in a really bad mood. You know, start there. Start there. You know, just be nice. Just be polite. You know what? She might not entertain it. Maybe not the first time. Maybe not the second time. Maybe it takes 1,000 times of you walking into that store and being just nice and polite, and suddenly the mask might drop and you end up having an interaction with another human being that cannot be quantified, that AI can never recreate. You know, it's those are the things, those are the moments that we remember, right? And so just start from where you can. Start in your neighborhood.
Just be friendly, be polite, be sincere.
Yeah, I think that's where it is, actually. I mean, that kind of goes back to what I just said, you know, start where you are, start within your community.
Yeah.
You know, pockets of resistance can quickly become a mass movement, you know. You know, if you have small embedded communities that are deciding to show up differently with each other, that quite easily can become contagious. And before you know it, you have lots of communities, you know, embodying the same attitude, the same ethos. So I think that's important. But, you know, that's the thing. And I'm not going to say that that's easy. I think it's actually very, very difficult to do for most people in the modern world. I mean, if I speak to most people in the modern world, they don't know who their neighbor is.
Mm.
You know, when they've been living there for years and they've never had a conversation with the person upstairs from them. So, you know, it just takes one person to start the movement. And once one person takes ownership of that and says, you know what, I understand the machine exists, but I don't need to show up how everybody else is. I can choose to show up differently. I think that's where the movement begins. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think the real beauty, the real energy behind this would be in community.
A healthy mind in a healthy body, not an alienated mind or spiritual activity in a strange body. So got to marry them together so as to produce the best outcome.
Yeah, you said it for me, man. You said it for me because it's in the essay, right? So yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Again, it's something we talked about right in the beginning of our conversation. I think a lot of times when you talk to people, when they look back, they had an inkling from a very young age already. There was a feeling, there was a sense of who they were, right? I hate that term, but let's use it. Their authentic self. And so when I look at what I'm doing now, in some weird but fantastic kind of way, I've gone back to the Rodney who was 4, 5, and 6 years old, before the environment really got hold of me and changed who I became, right? Because it was very evident that I had to change who I was in order to survive. I was getting bullied. There were gangs. There were bullies at school. My house wasn't safe. It's one of the reasons why I started training martial arts, because I wanted to learn how to fight back, right? And very early on, I realized that I couldn't show up who I was. It wasn't accepted. It wasn't accepted by my peers. It wasn't accepted by the teachers. So I molded myself into something. And, you know, right or wrong, the point is I carried that for a very long time. And it's only as I've grown older and matured, and in the last decade, and getting the health diagnosis that I got, where it was like, listen, you know, you can't continue doing what you're doing. In a way, it kind of forced me to kind of take a step back and relook at everything. Yeah. And in some way, what I'm trying to say is I've come back to the kid I always was, right? Because when I reflect back on who I was as a child before I got, you know, manipulated by the machine and all those things, I was a creative kid. I was a relatively quiet child. I had a great imagination. I loved nature. You know, I had moments of awe and wonder. And somewhere on the line, I lost that. But I think the reason I lost it is because, like so many of us, we feel like we get forced into this kind of path that is not our own, and we do what we need to do in order to meet the expectations of the society we find ourselves in, only to get to the end and go, actually, that's not who I was. So I think, you know, there's something beautiful in giving yourself permission to say, this is who I am. I am who I am, and I will find a way to get to where I need to get to. I'll find a way, right? And so that's kind of what I did, right? And you know, even though I could probably make the argument that there's certain things in my life that I shouldn't have done, or I shouldn't have gone down that road. Again, coming back to what I said earlier, in hindsight, it's as if my life was being directed, as if it was meant to go where it was supposed to go. And now I find myself where I am. And there's also a part of accepting that, right? And also acknowledging that it's never too late. That's the other thing too. I hope that comes across in my essay, is that it's never too late. It's never too late to show up differently. You know, just because you might have been one thing for a very long time, and you know it's not who you're supposed to be, and then you make that decision to show up differently, you can do that at any time that you want to, acknowledging that constraints still exist, and probably you're going to get pushback. And that's okay too. You know, you have to be strong enough to deal with the pushback, but you will be happier for that, right? You'll be happier for that. I mean, I think leading to that, just maybe to end this point in this conversation, is that a little while ago, I can't remember the book. I was reading a book about a lady that she worked with people as end of care, right? So as people were in their last moments on this planet, and she started talking to them, obviously, and she ended up doing a lot of interviews and then wrote a book. And she would ask them questions like, you know, you're near the end, you're 80, you're 90 years old. What do you regret? Like, what would you change about your life, right? And invariably, her research showed that most people pretty much said the same thing. Nobody said, oh, you know what? I wish I went to more meetings. I wish I did more spreadsheets. I wish I spent more time on Instagram. Nobody said things like that. It was, you know what? I wish I was more authentic. I wish I allowed myself to be who I really was. That was one of the big ones. The other one was, I wish I'd spend more time with the people that I loved and I cared about. That was another one, right? Yeah. So these kind of what we could call perennial human meaning making experiences is what they reflected on. And again, you know, the Stoics in their own way talk about this, where they say, you know what, kind of reflect like, you know, on the end, reflect like your life has ended. I think there's something powerful about that, because, you know, if you don't act like, oh, you know, I can do it tomorrow, but maybe today is the end, then you can relook at your life in a very different way. The thing that always stands out for me, like to kind of put it into perspective, because it can seem quite, you know, ambiguous, is I say to people, you know, that research shows that if we look at the average human life, most people only have 4,000 weeks on this planet. 4,000 weeks, that's it. That's not a long time if you think about it, right? Where I am right now in my life, I'm like, I think I'm 52 this year, right? So, you know, if I put myself on that, you know, schedule, I've got less than 2,000 weeks left, you know, maybe 1,500, somewhere around there, 1,500 weeks, and that's probably the end. You know, how do you want to show up? How do you want to live? You know, that's the thing you have to ask yourself.
Yeah, how true. How easy is it to retain your ethical choices your way?
That is probably one of the hardest ones.
Yeah.
Right? And I think a lot of times that does definitely come within your means. Like, ideally, I would want to make sure that I only eat organic produce, right? That if I do happen to eat meat, that it's ethically sourced. We can have all these conversations, right? That's not always possible for everybody. So I think, I know it doesn't answer the question, and maybe it seems like I'm avoiding it, but I think you have to do what you can do, knowing that that was the best choice you have, right? If you have two choices in front of you and you feel that one is more ethically sound than the other, and you can make that choice, you should make it. I think that's the other thing, is that we need to stop feeling guilty for potentially a system that we in of ourselves, not by ourselves, we did not create the system. This system has been created for a very long time. I mean, depending on who you speak to, they might give you different answers to that, but let's say like the moment we started planting, right? The moment we started creating agriculture, from that moment forward, we started bringing, you know, going from hunter-gatherers into much bigger groups, into cities, and so on and so on and so on. And yeah, we find ourselves where we are today, right? Again, it comes back to that whole initial idea of like, I didn't choose where I was going to be born. I landed up where I landed up, right? So we have to do the best that we can. But I do think that we need to take a little bit of pressure off ourselves and not always feel like, you know, we're the problem. You know, there are things that are happening that are in essence outside of our control, and no amount of anything's going to change it. That doesn't mean you should accept it, but you can acknowledge it and you can say, look, you know, this isn't fair, this isn't right. But then, you know, the onus is on you to decide what choices you make. Like for me personally, ethically, what I've tried to do as best as I possibly can now in this part of my life is I've simplified my life. I've minimized as much as I possibly can. I have the smallest footprint that I feel I'm able to have, you know, so that I'm not a burden on this beautiful planet that we all inhabit, right? And so I'm trying my best to do what I can within my means. I am still privileged that I can even do that, right? And I acknowledge my privilege. Other people may not have that same opportunity. That doesn't mean that you can't do something, right? I mean, just the ethical thing could be just you helping your neighbor and not expecting anything in return. It doesn't cost any money for you to do that.
Yeah.
You know, it's something good to do for another person.
Yeah, I agree. Do you think that order could exist in the midst of an observed world?
Well, I mean, I suppose it depends on how you define order, right? I mean, I think anybody who's lived long enough knows that your life is unpredictable, right? You really don't know what's going to happen from day to day. I mean, the Buddha said that, right? He said, your problem is it's not what's happening on the outside, it's how you interpret it on the inside. And his whole message was that everything is impermanent.
Yes.
Right? Everything is in flux.
Yes, like Heraclitus.
Yeah, exactly. Heraclitus. Yeah, exactly. So I would say maybe that is also part of the machine's kind of misdirection to make you want to seek control where control can never happen. It's almost the machine's way of trying to control you again with control, because you're trying to find order in chaos. Maybe the goal is to surf the edge of chaos. Again, recognizing that, you know, life is unpredictable, it's impermanent, but it's what I do in the moment that decides how the next moment is going to unfold, right? And in one respect, that would be what mindfulness ultimately is about, is your ability to be present in the moment, right? Not to be attached to the future, not to be holding on to the past, but to be right here, right now. But more than that, because this is where the kind of secular mindfulness stops. This is where, you know, Mac mindfulness kind of is everywhere, right? It's also you reflecting on your behavior and how you are showing up and how you're engaging, and choosing a different way, choosing a more productive, happier, you know, a nicer way to show up where it doesn't impact anybody else. I think that's kind of like my kind of goal always when I'm making decisions, when I do have the luxury of some time to be able to reflect on it. I always think, if I do this next, will that hurt anybody? And I mean that either physically, emotionally, or spiritually. And if I'm confident that it's not going to do that, then I think then that's a right decision, right? And so, you know, I try to always simplify things for myself, because I think a lot of times things get too complicated. And, you know, you need to be doing good, but you also need to be a good human. And being a good human is ensuring that your actions don't impact on other people in a negative way. And of course, we can't avoid that. It happens sometimes. But then are you brave enough to apologize and say, look, I'm sorry, I messed up. That wasn't right. And can I make it right? You know, and that's so much of what we have today is part of this problem, is that people don't want to do that, you know. And again, we're back to the same initial conversation. So why don't people want to do that? Well, because we keep getting pushed down our throat that we need to be hyper individuals. You know, there's a difference between being an individual and being independent. I want my children to be independent, you know, so they can do the things they need to do to live in this world. But I don't think hyper individuality is a good thing, because then when you're in that space, you will do whatever it takes to get to the top, regardless of what it might do to people in the process. And that's where people end up getting hurt. But because you've convinced yourself that that's how the world works and should work, you don't care about the destruction that you leave in your wake. And so I think even that distinction between individuality and being independent is also quite crucial, right? But, you know, coming back to center it is like, you know, do good and be good. And, you know, ask yourself, like, if I make this next move, how is it going to impact the other person? Even if it's a person you don't like.
Yeah, there's always room for personal, professional, and societal development.
Yeah, exactly.
And improvement.
Absolutely.
And the whole issue is about human flourishing, as you say. And I'd like to close by a quote of yours on Substack, when you say, human flourishing means growing into the best version of yourself, finding purpose, building strong relationships, staying true to your values, and bouncing back from challenges. It's about becoming a better person over time, making a positive impact on others, and living a life that feels good and does good. I'd like you to tell our audience where they can find you on social media.
Well, I try to
Once
stay away
again.
from social. I try and stay away from social media these days. But yeah, if they want to find me, they can go to my website, coachingphilosophia.org. Everything is on there. From there, they can find my newsletter. Maybe you can put it in the show notes on YouTube, the link for Living in the Absurd, so that they can download it free if they want to read it themselves. Yeah, that's the best way to do it. I'm always open to people email me, and probably the next best place is LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn if anybody's there. Just look for Coach Rodney King. I'm there. Yeah, but you know what we didn't talk about, Demetrius? We didn't talk about is what we started off talking about before we started recording. And you were saying to me, oh, you should get this published. And I said, you know, yeah. I actually sent it out to publishers and I was declined. So if anybody's listening and they are a publisher and they read it and they want to publish it, let's talk. But I know why it was declined is because everything we've been talking about. I'm basically in Living the Absurd. I'm rallying against the machine. I'm saying, no, hold on a second. Something's not right here. There's another way to show up, right? Well, you can see why the publishing machine may not want to entertain that.
Thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon.
You too. Cheers.